Continuing page 12. It is true, of course, that the NKVD, in the absence of the person it wanted, would make his relatives guarantee not to leave the area. Of course, it was easy to cook up a case against those who stayed behind to replace the one who had fled. Universal innocence also gave rise to universal failure to act. Maybe they won't take you. Maybe it will all blow over. A.I. Ledyshinsky was a chief teacher in a school in remote Kologriv. In 1937, a peasant approached him in an open market and passed him a message from a third person. Alexander Ivanich, get out of town, you're on the list. But he stayed. After all, the whole school rests on my shoulders, and their own children are pupils here. How can they arrest me? Several days later, he was arrested. Not everyone was so fortunate as to understand at the age of 14, as did Vanya Levitsky. Every honest man is sure to go to prison. Right now, my papa is serving time, and when I grow up, they'll put me in too. They put him in when he was 23 years old. The majority sit quietly and dare to hope. Since you aren't guilty, then how can they arrest you? It's a mistake. They are already dragging you along by the collar, and you still keep exclaiming to yourself, it's a mistake. They'll set things straight and let me out. Others are being arrested en masse, and that's a bothersome fact. But in other cases, there's always some dark area. Maybe he was guilty. But as for you, you're obviously innocent. You still believe that the organs are humanly logical institutions. They will set things straight and let you out. Why then should you run away? How can you resist right then? After all, you only make your situation worse. Make it more difficult for them to sort out the mistake. And it isn't just that you don't put up any resistance, you even walk down the stairs on tiptoe as you are ordered to do, so your neighbors won't hear. At what point, then, should one resist? When one's belt is taken away? When one is ordered to face in a corner? When one crosses the threshold of one's home? An arrest consists of a series of incidental irrelevancies, of a multitude of things that do not matter, and there seems no point in arguing about any one of them individually, especially at a time when the thoughts of the person arrested are wrapped tightly around the big question, what for? And yet all these incidental irrelevancies taken together implacably constitute the arrest. Almost anything can occupy the thoughts of a person who has just been arrested. This alone would fill volumes. There can be feelings which we never suspected. When 19-year-old Yevgenia Doyorenko was arrested in 1921, and 3 young Czechists were poking about her bed and threw her underwear in her chest of drawers, she was not disturbed. There was nothing there, and they would find nothing. But all of a sudden they touched her personal diary, which she would not have shown even her own mother. And these hostile young strangers, reading the words she had written, was more devastating to her than the whole Lubyanka with its bars and its cellars. It is true that many of the outrage inflicted by arrest on their personal feelings and attachments can be far, far stronger than their political beliefs or their fear of prison. A person who is not inwardly prepared for the use of violence against him is always weaker than the person committing the violence. There are a few bright and daring individuals who understand instantly. Grigoriev, the director of the Geological Institute of the Academy of Sciences, barricaded himself inside and spent 2 hours burning up his papers when they came to arrest him in 1948. Sometimes the principal emotion of the person arrested is relief and even happiness. This is another aspect of human nature. It happened to before the revolution too. The Yekaterinodar school teacher, Serdyukova, involved In the case of Alexander Ulyanov, felt only relief when she was arrested, but this feeling was 1,000 times stronger during the epidemics of arrests when all around you they were hauling people in like yourself and still had not come for you. For some reason they were taking their time. After all, that kind of exhaustion, that kind of suffering is worse than any kind of arrest, and not only for a person of limited courage. Vasily Vlasov, a fearless communist, who we shall recall more than once later on, renounced the idea of escape proposed by his non-party assistants and pined away because the entire leadership of the Katy district was arrested in 1937, and they kept delaying and delaying his own arrest. He could only endure the blow head-on. He did endure it, and then he relaxed, and during the first days of his arrest he felt marvelous. In 1944, the priest Father Irakli went to Alma-Ata to visit some believers in exile there. During his absence, they came 3 times to his Moscow apartment to arrest him. When he returned, members of his flock met him at the station and refused to let him go home. And for 8 years, hid him in one apartment or another. Wow. Wonderful, friends. The priest suffered so painfully from this harried life that when he was finally arrested in 1942, he sang hymns of praise to God. I think we could probably all understand that. Yeah. In this chapter, we are speaking only of the masses and the helpless rabbits arrested for no one knows what reason. But in this book, we will also have to touch on those who in post-revolutionary times remained genuinely political. Vera Rybakova, a social democratic student, dreamed when she was in freedom of being in the detention center in Suzdal. Only there did she hope to encounter her old comrades, for there were none of them left in freedom, and only there could she work on her world outlook. The socialist revolutionary, the SR, Ekaterina Olitskaya, didn't consider herself worthy of being imprisoned in 1924. After all, Russia's best people had served time, she was still young and had not yet done anything for Russia. But freedom itself was expelling her, and so both of them went to prison with pride and happiness. Resistance. Why didn't you resist? Today, those who have continued to live on in comfort scold those who suffered. Yes, resistance should have begun right there, at the moment of the arrest itself, but it did not begin. And so they are leading you. During a daylight arrest, there is always a brief and unique moment when they are leading you, either inconspicuously, on the basis of a cowardly deal you have made, or else quite openly, their pistols unholstered through a crowd of hundreds of just such doomed innocents as yourself. You aren't gagged. You really can and you really ought to cry out that you are being arrested. The villains in this guise are trapping people. That arrests are being made on the strength of false denunciations. The millions are being subjected to silent reprisals. If many such outcries had been heard all over the city in the course of the day, would not our fellow citizens perhaps have begun to bristle? And would arrest perhaps no longer have been so easy? In 1927, when submissiveness had not yet softened our brains to such a degree, 2 Chechists tried to arrest a woman in Serpukhov Square during the day. She grabbed a hold of the stanchion of a street lamp and began to scream, refusing to submit. A crowd gathered. There had to have been that kind of woman. There had to have been that kind of crowd, too. Passers-by didn't all close their eyes and hurry by. The quick young men immediately became flustered. They can't work in the public eye. They got into their car and fled. Right then and there, she should have gone to the railroad station and left, but she went home to spend the night, and during the night they took her off to the Lubyanka. Instead, not one sound comes from your parched lips, and that passing crowd naively believes that you and your executioners are friends out for a stroll. I myself often had the chance to cry out. On the 11th day after my arrest, 3 Smersh bombs had more burdened by 4 suitcases full of war booty than by me. They had come to rely on me in the course of the long trip, brought me to the Belarusian station in Moscow. They were called a special convoy, in other words, a special escort guard, but in actual fact their automatic pistols only interfered with their dragging along the 4 terribly heavy bags of loot they and their chiefs in Smersh counterintelligence on the Second Belarusian Front had plundered in Germany and were now bringing to their families in the fatherland under the pretext of convoying me. I myself lugged a 5th suitcase with no great joy, since it contained my diaries and literary works, which were being used as evidence against me. Not one of the 3 knew the city, and it was up to me to pick the shortest route to the prison. I had personally to conduct them to the Lubyanka, where they had never been before, and which in fact I confused with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I had spent the day in the counterintelligence prison at Army headquarters and 3 days in the counterintelligence prison at the headquarters of the front, where my cellmates had educated me in the deceptions practiced by the interrogators, their threats and beatings, in the fact that one person was arrested. Once a person was arrested, he was never released, and in the inevitability of a 10-year sentence. Then, by a miracle, I had suddenly burst out of there, and for 4 days had traveled like a free person among free people, even though my flanks had already laid on rotten straw beside the latrine bucket. My eyes had already beheld beaten up and sleepless men. My ears had heard the truth, and my mouth had tasted prison gruel. So why did I keep silent? Why, at my last minute out in the open, did I not attempt to enlighten the hoodwinked crowd? I kept silent, too, in the Polish city of Brodnica. But maybe they didn't understand Russian there. I didn't call out one word on the streets of Bialystok, but maybe it wasn't a matter that concerned the Poles. I didn't utter a sound at the Volkovsk station, but there were very few people there. I walked along the Minsk station beside those same bandits as if nothing at all were amiss. But the station was still a ruin, and now I was leading the Smersh men through the circular upper concourse of the Belarusian radial subway station on the Moscow Circle line, and its white-ceilinged dome and brilliant electric lights, and opposite us 2 parallel escalators thickly packed with Muscovites rising from below. It seemed as though they were all looking at me. They kept coming in an endless ribbon from down there, from the depths of ignorance, on and on beneath the gleaming dome, reaching towards me for at least one word of truth. So why did I keep silent? Every man always has handy a dozen glib reasons why he is right not to sacrifice himself. Some still have hopes of a favorable outcome to their case and are afraid to ruin their chances by an outcry, for after all, we got no news from that other world, and we did not realize that from the very moment of our arrest, our fate has almost certainly been decided in the worst possible sense, and that we cannot make it any worse. Others have not yet attained the mature concepts on which a shout of protest to the crowd must be based. Indeed, only a revolutionary has slogans on his lips that are crying to be uttered aloud. And where would the uninvolved, peaceable average man come by such slogans? He simply does not know what to shout. And then, last of all, there is a person whose heart is too full of emotion, whose eyes have seen too much, for that whole ocean to pour forth in a few disconnected cries. As for me, I kept silent for one further reason, because those Muscovites thronging the steps of the escalators were too few for me, too few. Here my cry would have been heard by 200 or twice 200, but what about the 200 million? Vaguely, unclearly, I had this vision someday that I would cry out to 200 million, but for the time being, I did not open my mouth, and the escalator dragged me implacably down to the netherworld. And when I got to Al-Qatni or Riyadh, I continued to keep silent, nor did I utter a cry at the Metropole Hotel, nor wave my arms on the Golgotha of Lubyanka Square. Mine was probably the easiest imaginable kind of arrest. It did not tear me from the embrace of kith or kin, nor wrench me from a deeply cherished home life. One pallid European February, it took me from our narrow salient on the Baltic Sea, where, depending on one's point of view, either we had surrounded the Germans or they had surrounded us, and it deprived me only of my familiar artillery battery and the scenes of the last 3 months of the war. The brigade commander called me to his headquarters and asked me for my pistol. I turned it over without suspecting any evil intent, when suddenly, from a tense, immobile suite of staff officers in the corner, 2 counterintelligence officers stepped forward, hurriedly, crossing the room in a few quick bounds, their 4 hands grabbing simultaneously at the star on my cap, my shoulder boards, my officer's belt, my map case, and they shouted theatrically, "You are under arrest." Burning and prickling from head to toe, all I could exclaim was, "Me? What for?" And even though there is usually no answer to this question, surprisingly, I received one. This is worth recalling because it is so contrary to our usual custom. Hardly had the Smersh men finished plucking me and taken my notes on political subjects along with my map case and begun to push me as quickly as possible toward the exit, urged on by the German shell fire rattling the window panes. Then I heard myself firmly addressed. Yes, another sheer gap separating me from those left behind. The gap created by the heavy falling word arrest. Across that quarantine line, not even a sound dared penetrate, came the unthinkable magic words of the brigade commander, Solzhenitsyn, "Come back here." With a sharp turn, I broke away from the hands of the Smershmen and stepped back to the brigade commander. I had never known him very well. He had never condescended to run-of-the-mill conversations with me. To me, his face had always conveyed an order, a command, wrath, but right now it's illuminated in a thoughtful way. Was it for shame for his own involuntary part in this dirty business? Was it from an impulse to rise above the pitiful subordination of a whole lifetime? 10 days before, I had led my own reconnaissance battery, almost intact, out of the fire pocket, in which the 12 heavy guns of his artillery battalion had been left. And now he had to renounce me because of a piece of paper with a seal on it. "You have," he asked weightily, "a friend on the 1st Ukrainian front?" "It's forbidden. You have no right," the captain and major of counterintelligence shouted at the colonel. In the corner, the suite of staff officers crowded closer to each other in fright, as they feared to share the brigade commander's unbelievable rashness, the political officers among them already preparing these materials against him, already preparing to present materials against him. But I had already understood. I knew instantly I had been arrested because of my correspondence with a school friend, and I understood from what direction to expect danger. Zakhar Grigorievich Travkin could have stopped right there, but no, continuing his attempt to expunge his part in this and to stand erect before his own conscience, he rose from behind the desk. He had never stood up in my presence in my former life, and reached across the quarantine line that separated us and gave me his hand, although we would never have reached out his hand to me had I remained a free man. And pressing my hand while his whole suite stood there in mute horror, showing that warmth that may appear in a habitually severe face, he fearlessly and precisely said, "Excuse me, I wish you happiness, Captain. Not only was I no longer a captain, but I had been exposed as an enemy of the people, for among us every person is totally exposed from the moment of arrest, and he had wished happiness to an enemy. The panes rattled, the German shells tore up the earth 200 yards away, reminding one that this could not have happened back in the rear, under ordinary circumstances of established existence, but only out here, under the breath of death, which was not only close by, but in the face of which all were equal. It's beautiful. This is not going to be a volume of memoirs about my own life. Therefore, I am not going to recount the truly amazing details of my arrest, which was like no other. That night, the Smersh officers gave up their last hope of being able to make out where we were on the map. They never had been able to read maps anyways, so they politely handed the map to me and asked me to tell the driver how to proceed to counterintelligence at Army headquarters. I therefore led them and myself to that prison, and in gratitude they immediately put me in, not an ordinary cell, but a punishment cell. I really must describe that closet in a German peasant house, which served as a temporary punishment cell. It was the length of one human body and wide enough for 3 to lie packed tightly, 4 at a pinch. As it happened, I was the 4th shoved right in after midnight. The 3 lying there blinked sleepily at me in the light of the smoky kerosene lantern and moved over, giving me enough space to lie on my side. Halfway between them, half on top of them, until gradually, by sheer weight, I could wedge my way in. And so 4 overcoats lay on the crushed straw floor, with 8 boots pointing at the door. They slept and I burned. The more self-assured I had been as a captain half a day before, the more painful it was to crowd onto the floor of that closet. Once or twice, the other fellows woke up numb on one side, and we all turned over at the same time. Toward morning, they awoke, yawned, grunted, pulled up their legs, moved into various corners, and our acquaintances began. "What are you in for?" But a troubled little breeze of caution had already breathed on me beneath the poisoned roof of Smersh, and I pretended to be surprised. "No idea. Did bastards tell you?" However, my cellmates, tankmen in soft black helmets, hid nothing. They were 3 honest, open-hearted soldiers, people of a kind I had become attached to during the war years, because I myself was more complex and worse. All 3 had been officers. Their shoulder boards also had been viciously torn off, and in some places the cotton batting stuck out. On their stained field shirts, light patches indicated where the decorations had been removed, and there were dark red scars on their faces and arms, the result of wounds and burns. Their tank unit had, unfortunately, arrived for repairs in the village where the Smersh counterintelligence headquarters of the 48th Army was located. Still damp from the battle of the day before, yesterday they had gotten drunk on the outskirts of the village, broke into a bath where they had noticed 2 raunchy broads going to bathe. The girls, half-dressed, managed to get away all right from the soldiers' staggering, drunken legs, but one of them, it turned out, was a property of the Army Chief of Counterintelligence, no less. Yes, for 3 weeks the war had been going on inside Germany, and all of us knew very well that if the girls were German, they could be raped and then shot. This was almost a combat distinction. Had they been Polish girls, or our own displaced Russian girls, they could have been chased naked around the garden and slapped on the behind. An amusement, no more. An amusement, no more. But just because this one was the campaign wife of the Chief of Counterintelligence, write-offs deep in the rear, sergeant had viciously torn from the 3 frontline officers the shoulder boards awarded them by the front headquarters, and had taken off the decorations conferred upon them by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. And now these warriors, who had gone through the whole war, and who had no doubt crushed more than one line of enemy trenches, were waiting for a court-martial, whose members, had it not been for their tank, could have come nowhere near the village. We put out the kerosene lamp, which had already used up all the air there was to breathe. A Judas hole the size of a postage stamp had been cut in the door, and through it came direct light from the corridor. Then, as if afraid that with the coming of daylight we would have too much room in the punishment cell, they tossed in a 5th person. He stepped in wearing a newish red army tunic and cap that was also new, and when he stopped opposite the peephole we could see a fresh face with a turned-up nose and red cheek. "Where are you from, brother? Who are you?" "From the other side," he answered briskly. "A spy." "You're kidding." We were astounded. To be a spy and to admit it. Ch.1 and the brothers Tur had never written about that kind of spy story. "What is there to kid about in wartime?" the young fellow sighed reasonably. "And just how else can you get back home from being a POW? Well, you tell me." He had barely begun to tell us how, some days back, the Germans had led him through the front line so that he could play the spy and blow up bridges, whereupon he had gone immediately to the nearest battalion headquarters to turn himself in. But the weary, sleep-starved battalion commander hadn't believed his story about being a spy, and had sent him off to the nurse to get a pill. And at that moment, new impressions burst upon us. "Out for toilet call. Hands behind your backs," hollered a master sergeant Hardhead as the door sprang open. He was just built for swinging the tail of a 122mm cannon. A circle of machine gunners had been strung around the peasant courtyard, guarding the path which was pointed out to us and which went behind the barn. I was bursting with indignation that some ignoramus of a master sergeant dared give orders to us officers. Hands behind your backs. But the tank officers put their hands behind them, and I followed suit. Back of the barn was a small square area in which the snow had been all trampled down, but had not yet melted. It was soiled all over with human feces, so densely scattered over the whole square that it was difficult to find a spot to place one's 2 feet and squat. However, we spread ourselves about, and the 5 of us did squat down. 2 machine gunners grimly pointed their machine pistols at us as we squatted, and before a minute had passed, the master sergeant brusquely urged us on. "Come on, hurry it up. With us they do it quickly." Not far from me squatted one of the tankmen, a native of Rostov, a tall, melancholy senior lieutenant. His face was blackened with a thin film of metallic dust or smoke, but the big red scar stretching across his cheek stood out nonetheless. "What do you mean with us?" he asked quietly, indicating no intention of hurrying back to the punishment cell that still stank of kerosene. "Inspirsh counterintelligence." Master Sergeant shot back proudly and more resonantly than was called for. The counterintelligence men used to love that tastelessly concocted word, smirsh, manufactured from the initial syllables of the words for death to spy. They felt it intimidated people. "And with us we do it slowly," replied the senior lieutenant thoughtfully. His helmet was pulled back, uncovering his still untrimmed hair. His oaken, battle-hardened rear end was lifted toward the pleasant, coolish breeze. "Where do you mean with us?" The master sergeant barked at him more loudly than he needed to. "In the Red Army," the senior lieutenant replied very quietly from his heels, measuring with his look the cannon tailor that never was. Such were my first gulps of prison air. That's the end of chapter 1. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. Have a good night.